Welcome to the TRAction webinar on behavior change approaches to enable uptake and use of clean cook stoves, which is being sponsored by the WASHplus project. We have 3 panelists today who will each speak for approximately 10 minutes, and then we'll open up the session to questions after that. And now I'm going to turn the webinar over to Kendra Williams, who's a research analyst with the TRAction project, and she will introduce our speakers today and then give you some background information about TRAction. Kendra?
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Microphones figured out now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to start with a brief overview of TRAction and our household air pollution work before I turn the floor over to our speakers. Next slide, please. So the Translating Research into Action project, known as TRAction, is a USAID-funded project that supports implementation science research on maternal, newborn, and child health. Our project operates by identifying priority health problems and then awarding funding to institutions and organizations to conduct research on the topics identified. TRAction's goal is to generate evidence and recommendations on what works and also on how successful strategies can be carried out so that program implementers and policymakers can scale up successful approaches. TRAction promotes and shares these lessons learned, such as through webinars like this one, so that the findings can actually be used in practice. Next slide, please. TRAction supports research across many different countries through Latin America, Asia, and Africa, with a very large focus on Africa, as you can see from this list. Next slide. Our research focuses on many different topics in the areas of disease control, nutrition, environment, health service delivery, and access to care. And today we're going to be focusing on our household air pollution work. Next slide. Household air pollution is a serious threat to health, responsible for nearly 4 million premature deaths every year. Technologies are available that can significantly reduce the problem, but adoption and use of these technologies has been low, which is partly due to significant behavior changes that are required to adopt these technologies. Next slide, please. Switching from an open fire to an approved cook stove requires that individual users change their cooking behaviors, such as the way they prepare and load their fuel, the time that they devote to preparing and cooking, and also cleaning and caring for their device. But beyond the individual, other activities along the value chain must also be changed to create an enabling environment for cook stove adoption. And this can range from setting up systems to produce and manufacture stoves, marketing and dissemination, and building infrastructure for repairing and replacing stoves. Next slide. To address these challenges, it's important that behavior change techniques are incorporated into any cook stove problem. And for the purposes of our presentation today, we're defining behavior change techniques or strategies as the active ingredients in an intervention that are designed to alter or redirect behavior. Next slide, please. In an effort to increase the evidence on behavior change techniques for household air pollution reduction, TRAction funded 3 research teams to develop and test behavior change strategies that can increase the adoption of improved cook stoves. So today we'll hear lessons from each of these 3 teams on which strategies worked and which didn't. We'll hear from Path and Impact Carbon discussing lessons from their work in Uganda, and also from Duke discussing lessons from their work in India. Next slide. First, we'll hear from Alan Namagembe of Path, then from Teresa Beltramo of Impact Carbon, and finally from Mark Juland of Duke University. And then to wrap up, Kirsty, who is a TRAction, a consultant working with TRAction on our household air pollution portfolio, will summarize the cross-cutting lessons across all 3 of the projects. Next slide. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Alan. Is Alan with us? So I think Alan has been having some difficulties joining the webinar. She's joining from Uganda. So we also have Nancy Muller on the line, who also worked on the PATH research, who will be able to present this portion.
Hi, this is Nancy Muller. I'm presenting on behalf of Alan Namagembe, who has, as Kendra said, has had a hard time connecting. But she will be with us in spirit and put a great amount of effort into this project. Next slide, please. We wanted to give you a little bit of information about the approaches that we used. We conducted this project in 2 sub-counties in a central district in Uganda, Wakiso district. The population that we worked with included, it was very much community-based, community leaders and households. We worked with the Ministry of Health village health teams, and then trained direct sales agents who were also community members, some of whom were village health team members. And then we worked with the purchasers of the top-lit updraft stove, which is the stove that we use, the locally produced gasifier stove that's made in Uganda. PATH was the lead partner in this activity, and we worked with Berkeley Air Monitoring Group and their local partners, the Center for Integrated Research and Community Development in Uganda, and also the Joint Energy and Environment Projects, who represented our local link into the communities and conducted the cooking demonstrations. Next slide, please. The approaches that we used for behavior change varied. We trained, as I mentioned, village health team members on indoor air pollution and key messages related to that. We provided them with information flyers to give to households, and they made referrals to the direct sales agents who were selling these tea-led stoves. We also had cooking demonstrations in the community, and then towards the end of the project, as part of our iterative approach, we included some fuel access interventions. These were strengthening the salespeople who were able to provide already processed wood for the tea-led stoves, and also providing bow saws to the community and on a shared basis, and then they paid us back. Next slide, please. So we wanted to just jump into what worked on a high level. What we saw was that the community cooking demonstrations were incredibly effective. They really allowed the community to get excited about this stove, which initially took some work because it would take a while to get it going. But once it got going, people were very, very interested and excited to see how quickly it cooked, how little smoke was produced, and the fact that it produced charcoal at the end. So they could experience these benefits firsthand, and that was a very effective behavior change approach. They also were able to see the different steps of fuel preparation and loading and lighting, and they were able to ask questions of the sales of the community cooking demonstration representatives. Next slide, please. What else worked? Increasing access to the processed fuel. That we realized was the critical element, that even though some people were willing to buy the stove at varying prices, the fact that fuel was so challenging to prepare made it really a disincentive to people to use the stove, even if they had bought it. So once we introduced these 2 fuel processing interventions, we found that there was a 42% relative increase in the use of the stove in the people that had access to these interventions. Bearing in mind, if you look at this chart, that the overall usage was very low. The tea-led usage is at the very bottom. And also the numbers in the activity were small. We had a total of 20 people participating in the fuel intervention activities. Next slide, please. Information sources of having the village health team members be information sources in the community was an effective approach. They were able to help raise awareness and engage the community in the importance of addressing indoor air pollution and the various benefits of improved cook stoves. And they could also provide information on where to get the stoves and correct practices. Next slide, please. So the challenges, the things that really did not work well were the cost of the stove and, as I mentioned, the fuel access. Overall, the TLED was used only a total of 7% of the recorded use events based on the SUMS monitoring. And the barriers to use were the cost, both in money and time, of using the stove, and really the lack of access to the processed firewood. The design we found in doing a commercial viability assessment was really too expensive to manufacture locally and sell the way that we were doing, especially when you look at this added cost of the fuel. And it really made the stove not commercially viable in the way that we were working with it. And we even looked at the potential for microfinance and found that that still would not have made the stove viable. Next slide, please. And the stove really was not fully compatible with the cooking practices of the communities we were working in. There was stove stacking. Everybody had multiple stoves, and every stove was used for a different purpose. So the TLED was effective at things like cooking quickly, but it was too expensive to just boil water quickly. So they had to think ahead about what they were going to cook on it. And if a highly motivated user definitely could use it. There were several households that used it more than once a day, but that was out of the total user population, so it was not significant. And there was definitely mixed feedback on its ability to cook the staple foods that they eat in Uganda. Next slide, please. So what we would recommend is integrating cooking demonstrations in the communities into any cook stove intervention as a way to engage the community and help them to understand the benefits and the use steps of these stoves. Also to consider absolutely the fuel when selling a cook stove and finding ways to pair the access of the fuel with the stove. Training community health workers, I think we were surprised that that seemed to be an effective way of engaging the community, and because they were really trusted voices in the community and they were present a lot and they were members of the community, so many of them, we allowed them to buy a stove at a subsidized price initially, and that was definitely helpful because they could speak from experience. And then mapping out the true costs of manufacturing new and improved stove designs so that you can maximize the uptake. Next slide, please. Next steps for us are that we are looking into innovative sales and marketing and distribution approaches for clean fuels like LPG. We're very concerned with the health effects of cook stoves, and we want to look at approaches that we feel like could have the quickest route to affecting health, understanding that there will be many issues related to marketing and distribution and cost that need to be addressed. We're also looking at bundling improved cook stoves and fuels with other consumer goods and looking at ways of financing them. So the third approach would be to identify financing mechanisms that could make these products more affordable and more commercially viable. Next slide. On behalf of Alan and the whole PATH team and Berkeley R&G partners, we thank you.
Great, thank you, Nancy. Thanks for jumping in at the last minute there. Now I will hand the line over to Teresa.
Thanks, Kendra, and thanks, Nancy, and good morning, good afternoon to you. So let me begin by saying that if we were to think about the biggest problems affecting our world today, any socially conscious person would have to include poverty, disease, and climate change. Traditional cook stoves cause all three of these simultaneously. Yet little hard evidence has been gathered about what actually motivates purchase of and willingness to pay for non-traditional cook stoves. Next. Today I present results from our USAID TRAction funded research, which has been designed in collaboration with colleagues David Levine at Berkeley and Garrick Blaylock at Cornell. The goal of this research is to test some solutions to hypothesized barriers to adoption of non-traditional cook stoves. In particular, today, I will present on 2 of 4 randomized controlled trials funded by USAID. And the first randomized controlled trial test can improve contracts, increase uptake of clean cook stoves. And the second test, what factors affect willingness to pay for clean cook stoves? Particularly, we test, do marketing messages related to the cook stove saves time and money, and the stove improves health, increase willingness to pay for non-traditional cook stoves. And this research takes place in rural western Uganda. Next. So before I dive into our main results, I wanted to share some key lessons from our project preparation stage. I think first, spend the time to vet the stove with the local community to ensure that the best stove is chosen which fits the community's needs. We built in a 6-month feasibility stage where we trialed the above 4 different stove types in 2 test communities within that same study zone. Our trials included a consumer cross-comparison of stoves, where we lent each of these 4 stove types to more than 20 households for 2 weeks, and then we swapped the stove with another type for a second in-home 2-week trial. We led 3 focus groups with women where we marketed each of the 4 stoves and solicited targeted feedback. And together with our local implementing partner, Circudu, we led a community meeting with men and women, again, marketing these 4 stove types and soliciting feedback. Throughout this process and throughout our entire study, we employed a qualitative researcher to record all this feedback and use this evidence to select the stove which best aligned with the local community's cooking practices and needs. And then second, during this 6-month period in our test villages, we used this community interaction to design vivid marketing messages which were based on actual stories and experiences with the EnviroFit, that was the stove we chose, pictured on the left, in our 2 test communities. I think third, we found that engaging local stakeholders helped make this project successful. We worked with our local project partner, Circudu, and together they helped us identify government and local stakeholders in the region, who then helped us identify existing local community organizers in our communities that we led our research. And we engaged those local community organizers as focal point people in our project. For a small fee, the focal point people were tasked with raising awareness and gathering local community members for our sales meetings and collecting payments for our stove. Next. Let me turn to our first randomized controlled trial, which tests the role of improved contracts on uptake of clean cook stoves. This study was designed based on a review of the existing literature, which identified some common obstacles to adoption of durable goods by poor households. These obstacles include households might be liquidity or credit constrained, they might lack information on the benefits and durability of the product, and they might suffer from self-control problems, or otherwise known as present bias. So based on these obstacles, we tested the effect of offering an improved contract which addresses the following barriers to adoption. So our improved contract includes a free trial, which is included to overcome the obstacle of imperfect information about energy savings. We include time payments to address liquidity constraints and present bias. And then we offer participants the right to stop time payments and return the product at any point during time payments in order to overcome the obstacle of imperfect information on product durability. Next. So our study is designed as follows. We randomly selected 10 subsets of villages, which are called parishes in Uganda, so the groupings of villages, if you will, to receive what we call a pay within the week sales offer, and 14 parishes to receive the improved contract I just described to you. The pay within the week offer, we had an initial sales meeting, and we gave households a week to go home and gather funds before we had our second sales meeting. And our sample size is on average about 60 people per parish meeting, and we had 412 households attend our sales meeting in our pay within the week offer and 720 in our improved contract offer. Then for both sales offers, we held marketing meetings and to sell the stoves in each community. Our price was US $16, and we set this price based on our previous willingness to pay experiment, which I'll describe next. And at the sales meeting, people placed orders to purchase stoves. Next. The results from this randomized control trial show that consumers offered the optimal contract buy the stove 11 times more than those offered the pay within the week offer. This figure shows results both from our USAID funded research using the wood burning EnviroFit cook stove on the right, and then a previous replica study that we ran in urban Kampala using a charcoal stove on the left. From our wood burning study, again, I just described you purchase on the right, you can see that uptake of the non-traditional wood burning stove was 5% with the pay within the week offer. And uptake after 8.2% returns rose to 57% with the novel offer. These results are strikingly similar to our previous study in urban Kampala that we conducted with the charcoal stove. In urban Kampala, uptake of an efficient charcoal burning stove was 4% with the pay within the week offer. And uptake after 6% returns increased to 45% with the novel offer. And notably, over 90% of consumers in both of our studies who took the free trial in our improved contract offer completed their payments of the stove. And then finally, external validity is always a concern with any field experiment. The fact that our improved contract raised purchase of non-traditional cook stoves more than 11-fold in 2 different settings with 2 different stoves suggests that these results will plausibly generalize to different contexts. Next. So our second study had the following design. We selected 36 parishes to hold a meeting, and we auctioned 2 EnviroFit stoves using Vickery second price auctions. Our sample size was about a little over 2,100 participants. Next, we divided the participants, again about an average meeting size of 60 people, into 4 groups, and we randomized that selection. So group 1 received a message related to the EnviroFit improves health. Group 2 received a message related to the EnviroFit saves time and money. Group 3 received both messages, and Group 4 received no message. And then next, we hold 2 auctions, first with the pay within the week offer, and then we hold a second auction where people were allowed to bid on the stove that they would pay in 4 weekly installments. So we included time payments. Next. What do we find? We find that marketing messages do not affect willingness to pay. There's no effect for marketing messages on willingness to pay, whether it's health, whether it's time saves, the stove saves time and money. Time payments, though, do raise willingness to pay for a non-traditional cook stove by 41%. Not surprisingly, wealth matters. Each additional asset owned increased willingness to pay by 10%. And when we test for the role of a stable income, we find that having a stable income increases willingness to pay by 8 to 10% for both men and women participants. But there's no effect of having a stable income on willingness to pay for married women. We find large gender differences. On average, men are willing to pay 21 to 23% more than women for the cook stove. Next. The success of the improved contract suggests liquidity constraints, present bias, concerns about savings and durability are all important barriers to address in cook stove programs. Over 90% of our participants who accepted a free trial successfully completed time payments in both studies. So you can, we feel that this research shows that you can roll out improved contracts, and they do work. Some strategies to help keep costs of payment collection low include employing focal point people, as we did, to collect the funds, and or, where appropriate, using mobile payments. Next. So for practitioners who are looking forward, I think one key message that's coming out from our research is, marketing messages are not sufficient to address obstacles to adoption of non-traditional cook stoves. Further, given evidence of reduced purchasing power of women, future stove projects should consider promoting stoves with features that are valued more highly by men. And then addressing barriers to adoption, particularly liquidity constraints, via time payments, for example, can significantly increase demand for cook stoves. We have 41% increase. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Teresa. And lastly, we'll hear from Mark Juland about the Duke project.
Hello, this is Mark Juland. I'm from Duke University in the Sanford School of Public Policy. I'll be talking about our TRAction project, which was carried out in rural India. And as I start, I think I would re-emphasize some of the points already made. So first, that much is known about the negative effects of biomass burning in traditional cook stoves, but that relatively little is known about what can be done to stimulate adoption of new improved stoves. And so that provides much of the motivation for how we designed our study and some of what I'll talk about today. Next slide. So I'll begin with discussing the main study hypotheses and features, and then talk about the main lessons learned from the research. Next. Our basic approach was very much motivated by this problem of not knowing much about what can be done to stimulate adoption of improved stoves. Next slide. So we took a pretty deliberate approach as we were designing our experimental study. And this began with a literature review looking at prior evidence, both from the literature on improved cook stoves, but more generally on other environmental health improving technologies. Next. And then we went to the field and collected detailed baseline data on about 2,000 households in 2 different locations in India, which I'll talk about in a minute, to better understand baseline cooking practices, knowledge and perceptions of improved stoves as well as traditional stoves, and learning about stove design preferences through some stated preference discrete choice experiments. Next. Using this baseline data, we developed a series of pilots where we tested different potential intervention features. And these intervention features came out of the lessons of these pilots. So the pilot experiments, they taught us a number of important things. First, that knowledge of improved cook stoves, at least in terms of the benefits of improved cook stoves, was quite limited. Now, the second big lesson from these pilots was that stove choice appears to matter and that not all households favor the same technology. The third thing that we learned was that many of these rural and poor households are heavily liquidity constrained, and so paying for stoves in one single upfront payment was something that very few households would consider seriously. And then finally, building on the liquidity constraint point, we also found that demand for improved cook stoves was fairly limited. Next. So with these lessons, we developed an intervention experiment to test for the effectiveness of specific features of the stove promotion program. Next slide. And just to tell you a bit more about the context of our surveys, we collected the baseline data in the Gangetic Plains of Uttar Pradesh, highly densely populated zone, kind of a hotspot for traditional biomass burning in traditional stoves. Next. And we also collected baseline data in a very different context in the mountains of Uttarakhand, where there is also fairly high population pressure, but not nearly to the same extent. More fuel wood available to households, but also accessibility challenges. Next slide. And within these two states, we deliberately stratified our sample into observationally similar communities. So each of these had two sets of communities, one of which was a set of communities where our partner NGOs had prior experience working and promoting various technologies, though not necessarily cook stoves, and the other set of communities where they had not previously interacted, with the idea in mind that this institutional history and perhaps the relationship between institutions and households would make a difference in terms of the eventual success of a stove promotion program. Next. Okay, so our main experimental hypotheses coming out of the pilots were that, one, that intensive information and marketing would matter, and that this would only matter really if we designed a financing deal that would make sense for households, so meaning that we could address their liquidity constraint. And then the second, in order to deal with potentially low demand for the stoves, that incentives, price incentives and subsidies would matter. Next slide. So the features of our intervention experiment were first to provide information to all households on two different potentially improved stoves. One, a natural draft biomass burning stove, and the second, a very different technology, an electric coil stove that could be plugged into an electrical outlet. And these information sheets compared the stoves in terms of a variety of different attributes, their costs, the fuel requirement, things like the maintenance that would be required, the amount of smoke emitted by the stoves, etc. So you can see a picture of the information sheet on the left side. Next. The second component of the intervention was to provide personalized household demonstrations of the stoves. So every household in our sample, and these households were randomly selected from the communities that we were working in, received a household demonstration from a trained team of salespeople. Next slide. Next slide. And then the third feature was to allow households to make their payments in 3 even installments. This was to address the liquidity constraint that households might not be able to pay up front. The fourth feature being that we randomized these incentives to households, and the incentives were structured to be rebates that would be delivered to households at the time of the final installment payment. So it was a delayed subsidy, with the motivation being that this might encourage the households to experiment with the stoves, because the rebate was conditional on them using the stove, as observed by our sales teams. Next. The control households, who were the comparison group, received no information, no sales visits, and no sales offer. So we can think of this as 2 large groups of households, control and treatment households. And within the treatment households, they had different levels of rebates that were randomized. Next slide. Okay, so to tell you about the main lessons from our study. Next. The first major lesson is that it does appear possible to achieve high adoption in low-income settings. In our Uttarakhand sample, which is where we carried out the intervention, 57% of households were below the poverty line. In our treatment group, we see that ownership of improved stoves doubles from 30 to 60%. You may be surprised at those high baseline levels of improved stove ownership, but these are primarily LPG stoves, which have penetrated to some extent in rural India. In the control group, we see no increase in improved stove ownership over the time of the study. And essentially, this is evidence that with a full court press of information and promotion and I'll show you results on the incentives, it is possible to achieve high adoption of improved cook stoves. Next slide. We also see that modest price incentives can make a very big difference in terms of adoption. So the rebate levels are shown on the x-axis of this graph, and the 25 rupee rebate was really a token rebate that's about 2% of the cost of a stove, so not very much at all. Essentially what that group is testing is the effectiveness of this marketing campaign and the financing, the liquidity constraint addressing financing plan. If we increase the price incentives to about 10% of 20% of the cost of the stove, 200 rupees, we get adoption around 50% of the new stove technology. And then increasing it to a third of the cost of the stove, we were getting about 70% adoption among targeted households. These incentives also translate into greater use of the stoves, as we see in our follow-up surveys. And we were somewhat fearful about this, given some evidence that suggests that if people don't contribute as much to a technology, sometimes they don't use it as much. But we don't see that. Next slide. We also find that this effect of the micro-institution and the relationship between the institution and the communities makes a difference. So where our partner NGO had prior experience doing a variety of interventions, they got roughly 10% higher sales, which if we think of the average of 50% sales in these communities, that's about a 20% increase in sales compared to communities where they didn't have this prior experience and relationship. We also see in these communities that there's much greater use of stoves and greater fuel collection savings. We also believe that it's likely to be the case that this will make a larger difference as time goes on and maintenance needs arise in these communities. Next slide. It's very important, I think, when we think about designing these improved stove interventions to consider the role of technology choice and what households actually want. We observed great variation across households in our sample in terms of the various features that they placed the most weight on. In our pilot intervention experiences, we discovered that there was great enthusiasm for this completely different technology that we hadn't originally considered for our study, which was this electric stove. And then finally in the experiment, we see that there was great enthusiasm again for that stove. Roughly 3/4 of the purchases are for the electric stove, and the other quarter of households select the other alternative, which is the natural draft stove. And it's important to note that these two stoves were roughly the same price. Next slide. Finally, based on the experience from our pilots, we were able to design an intervention that achieved high adoption. But without really carefully testing these different features, and this involved products, as well as the demos and the sales pitches, and payment mechanisms, it's likely that we would have designed something that would not have been nearly as effective. So doing some small-scale experimentation prior to doing a large-scale increase and scaling up of an adoption program is pretty critical. Next slide. Finally, it was surprising to us the supply challenge in these locations. If we were looking for improved stoves in the marketplace in our study communities, we couldn't find very many at all. These stoves had to be sourced from larger urban areas and had to be carried long distances. What this speaks to is the fact that there's no real existing and robust market in rural areas of lower income countries. And that poses challenges not just for adoption, but also long-term maintenance. Because as these stoves fall apart or need to be fixed, who will actually fix these? Within our short-term study, we couldn't really investigate this question in great detail. But suffice to say that the goal of large-scale stove dissemination seems a long way off because of these supply challenges. And we think that the latent demand is there for many of these technologies, but getting the stoves to these sites is expensive and likely to drive up costs. Next slide. So here is a recap of our main lessons. And just to tell you a little bit about next steps in our thinking in terms of this study, we remain in close contact with our stove promotion NGO partner in Uttarakhand, and we plan to study longer-term impacts in these communities since we only measured short-term impacts in our follow-up survey. And part of that will also be trying to calculate better the costs and benefits of these interventions and what are some of these hidden supply costs that we don't know too much about. And then finally, perhaps doing some experimentation around maintenance and provision of maintenance to households that adopt these stoves in rural and remote locations. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. So now I will hand the floor over to Kirsty Jago to hear about our cross-cutting lessons.
Thank you, Kendra. We'd now like to take just the last 5 minutes to talk briefly about the cross-cutting lessons that emerged when looking at the 3 projects alongside each other. Even though they were carried out in 3 different locations, recurrent outcomes can be seen and provide us with overarching lessons. Briefly highlight a couple of things as we consider the lessons, though. Firstly, we should recognize that the behavioral change strategies or techniques discussed today occur along the full length of the clean cooking value chain, and that's from supply through to marketing and finance, as well as promotion of the correct use of the technology. And it became clear as we listened to these presentations that each behavioral change strategy would not be sufficient to make the complex behavior changes required in isolation, but instead involve many interacting components. I'm sorry, I should have said next slide before that one. So next slide. And then next slide. Sorry about that. It's a nice picture. Thank you. One of the first lessons to highlight is less to do with the behavioral change strategies, but more to do with what is needed for the behavior change to occur. And that is, finding the right product is key. And without this, no amount of behavioral change intervention will work. Working with the target communities to identify the product that is right for the people's needs, aspirations, and purchase capability is fundamental. The cycle of field testing and user feedback from all of the target market segments is crucial to get the right product. Next slide. When looking at determinants of successful large-scale cooking programs, it can often be seen that a stove that requires less adaptation in cooking habits and fuel preparation, but still provides clear benefits to the user, will be accepted into the cooking patterns more readily than one requiring large behavioral shifts. We saw how Path found the T-Lud had mixed ability to cook some staple foods, and the fuel type required by the stove required significant and sometimes unacceptable behavioral change by the end user, and both factors ultimately affected the level of stove use. Next slide. 2 of the projects showed that consideration needs to be given to the current and long-term mechanisms and channels for supply for the stoves, and if necessary, the required fuel at the beginning of the project. Mark just presented how the supply of the stoves was a great challenge and a potential barrier to scaling up the stove project. And Nancy also described how the use of the T-Lud actually increased when processed fuel was made available. These results demonstrate key prerequisites to enable the targeted behavioral change. Next slide. The projects also presented 2 effective mechanisms to stimulate demand for the new technologies in their target markets. They were to increase trust in the product and the people promoting and selling it, and once this has been achieved, to then effectively promote the product. Next slide. So a low level of trust in the product and the promoters can inhibit demand. This, we find, is a particular challenge in situations where people from outside the community are promoting a relatively expensive, unproven new technology. The studies highlighted several mechanisms that worked to gain the community's trust and ultimately had a positive impact on stove uptake. The free trial model presented by Teresa reduces commitment to buy until the product has been tried and concerns such as those regarding durability and ability to function have been addressed. Each of the studies actively engaged local trusted organizations and community members throughout the marketing process, which helped to develop a trusting relationship with the consumers. Mark described how working with a micro-institution or NGO that was already present in the village provided a valuable conduit to the community, making people more likely to listen and engage. And finally, Nancy discussed how the cooking demonstrations were useful to show the ability of the new technology to cook local foods, which is often a great concern within these communities, and thereby increasing trust in the product. Next slide. Product promotion can effectively stimulate demand. Yet our 3 studies came away with different, although perhaps not conflicting, results. PATH found that the cooking demonstrations with the T-lid stove stimulated demand and acquisition. Mark showed how a strong combination of information and promotion, including stove demonstrations, work well together to increase stove uptake. And Teresa and Impact Carbon worked to find the right marketing message in their community, but then found that the type of message did not ultimately affect willingness to pay. So perhaps live demonstrations are a stronger motivator to purpose than promises or claims regarding the stove's potential. Maybe these communities actually need to see the stove in action to be motivated to buy it. But one message we can draw from all the studies is that for promotional activities to be successful, extensive market and consumer research is needed to identify the most appropriate and impactful marketing messages, and perhaps more importantly, the right channels to deliver these. Next slide. Okay. The end user needs to have purchasing capability of the product offered. Without this, the program is not sustainable. We have seen that removing the barriers caused by liquidity constraints can have an impact on stove uptake. Both the Duke and the Impact Carbon studies showed that offering financial solutions had a positive impact on the uptake of the stove. However, finding the right financing mechanism for the community also requires consideration, and like all the other interventions we've discussed today, they need field testing and trialing for local acceptability. Next slide. I think the ultimate aim of all the behavioral change interventions that we present today is to achieve correct and consistent and hopefully exclusive use of a clean and efficient stove. PATH showed that the cooking demonstrations and well-trained respected VHTs can promote and support correct stove use, even when it requires very different techniques to the traditional methods. There is an argument that if the cook uses the stove correctly, he or she will be more likely to see the potential benefits of the stove, and so will be encouraged to continue using it. However, we saw that although perhaps correct, the overall use of the T-lid stove was very limited, primarily due to poor access to suitable fuel and limitations when cooking popular local foods. These reasons for the low adoption need to be considered and obviously addressed before planning future stove programs. Data will be made available on the use of the stoves from the Duke and the Impact Carbon studies in the future, and we hope to present more patterns and determinants of stove use at that point. Next slide. So today we've presented a brief overview of the high-level results from these 3 studies. These results provide valuable contributions to the discussion on what factors need to be in place for behavioral change to occur, as well as what behavioral change strategies are effective to stimulate the adoption of clean technologies. Further study and discussion is clearly required to explore which behavioral change strategies are most effective for enabling the adoption and consistent use of clean cooking solutions. And that's across the value chains from policymakers, producers, cooks, as well as the fuel sellers. The project results will be presented in more detail alongside several other articles in the Journal of Health Communications Special Issue on behavioral change in the clean cooking sector. Due to be published in January 2015, this issue aims to promote the practice of appropriately and effectively implementing behavior change strategies and techniques. So we're going to ask you to look out for that one. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Kirsty, and thank you to all of our presenters. We're now going to open the floor up for some questions. So please feel free, if you have a question that you would like to ask, either to a specific speaker or to all of the speakers, please go ahead and type that into your question box, and I will read them out. Our first question today is for Teresa. The question is, did you subsidize the price of the stove based on the willingness to pay study, or was $16 the commercial price for the stove in Uganda?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I didn't. I talked very high level about our project, and we did carbon credit our project. So there's a subsidy built into that $16 price that we were able to offer the price as low as $16 because Impact Carbon recovered costs on the stove in addition, because it costs more than $16 US to get the stove imported and to the door of our local villagers. So $16 was at a small profit. I would so we did sell the stove at a small profit or break even. We're still doing our numbers, but it's we were informed. The price was informed by our willingness to pay study. However, we also experimented a little bit more because our willingness to pay study was we ran second price auctions, and we did. There's some reasons why, and that second price auctions may not 100% correlate with actual posted price sales behaviors. So we did test a price point lower, actually, because our willingness to pay curve showed us that we should set the price lower. We tested it lower, and we found very large demand, so we raised our price to $16, and the rest of our initiative is at $16. So yes, it was informed by our willingness to pay study, and then we also tested the results again in posted price sales meetings to finalize our final price of $16 US.
Great, thank you, Teresa. Our next question is directed to all three presenters. The question is, how did each of you define adoption? Was it defined as purchase or use or both? And how was the actual use evaluated? So maybe Mark, do you want to take the first stab at this question?
Sure. So in the context of our study, because we had a relatively short time horizon after following our intervention experiment, we were really just looking at short-term adoption. The results that I presented in those slides were purchase primarily, but I can talk a little bit about the use results that we get from the follow-up survey. And there are various ways to define use of the stoves, but we looked at use on a daily basis as well as a measure of intense use, which meant that the household was using a stove for at least 30 minutes a day. And we find that this intense use is for our intervention stoves as well as improved stoves in general, so the LPG stoves that were owned at baseline. Intense use is only among about half of those stove owners, with daily use being somewhat higher than that. And it's important to emphasize, I think, that we don't think there's one specific definition of adoption that we should go with in this context, because these households are using multiple stoves, but rather we should differentiate different levels of use of the stoves over time. And of course, the longer-term question is whether households will continue to use these stoves at the rates that they're using them initially. And we would have to go back to study that. But our measurements of adoption are only about 2 to 3 months after the intervention.
This is Teresa here. So yeah, Thanks, Mark. I widely agree. To say for our study here that I presented, the two studies I presented, we look at uptake of stoves. So I have another work that, again, with my colleagues, looking at the adoption rate. So adoption being adoption of the EnviroFit in relationship to continued or not continued usage of the other stoves in the household. So we think of it as a kitchen level adoption. How does the EnviroFit in this setting fit in with other stoves that are previously used and maybe continue to be used? So I think for this setting, though, we looked at just uptake that I presented today. Forthcoming is adoption.
And this is Nancy for PATH. We measured stove acquisition by how many stoves were actually sold, and then looked at whether they had whether we had to lower the price or if it was sold at the full price. And then we also, Berkeley Air and Circadu measured the stove usage using sums, so we could actually track all the different stoves that were being used in a household and what level of how much cooking was being done in each one. That's how we found the 7% absolute usage of the TLUD. And then the third thing was correct use. We did some monitoring in our household surveys, looking at 29 different users, and found that actually 28 of them were able to use it correctly according to the key steps of preparing wood, loading, and lighting. So those were our measures of acquisition and use.
Great, thank you everyone. We have had a couple of questions come in from Mark about the subsidies that you mentioned. The questions are whether you can describe in a little bit more detail how they worked, what you mean by a hidden subsidy, and how they were linked to usage of the stoves.
Right, sure. Okay, so there are two distinct points there. So one is the subsidy that we provided in the experiment, which was a rebate off of the final installment payment for the stoves. So the way we structured the intervention, every household that would purchase a stove would purchase it over the course of 3 even payments, and at the time of the third payment, they would receive this rebate if the sales team found that they were using the stove when they went back to collect the final payment. And that use was observed by looking for evidence of ash and other use of the stove. We also had the ability to go back to these households later on to check out use. But the rebate was delivered to any household found using the stove, and it was actually delivered to every household that was paid, that had agreed to purchase a stove. So they were being encouraged by it. The other subsidy piece of this was the hidden subsidy that I referred to in my final slides, which is really what I mean by that is that there are a lot of hidden costs in this intervention that had to do with us getting these stoves to these rural communities. And we were selling them essentially at the manufacturer price. But getting the stoves up to the sales NGO, the cost of that whole promotion campaign and the cooking demonstrations, all of that is what I mean by hidden subsidies. And we were collecting information on how much all of those elements costed. So that's part of what we hope to do going forward in terms of a full accounting of the cost of this sales promotion, and what that entails in terms of an additional subsidy that the households were not paying for because they were only paying for that manufacturer price.
Great, thank you, Mark. We've also had several questions come in on the impact carbon finding on the marketing messages. The questions are, why did you not include the role of aspirations in your messaging? And also there's a comment that it may be more the channel plus the message than just the message itself that, that could be making the messages more or less effective. And that that should be explored further before we assume that marketing doesn't work. So maybe Teresa, if you can speak a little bit to why you did or didn't include aspirations in your messaging, and a little bit more information on that finding about the marketing.
Great, yeah. So how do we decide which marketing messages to use? Well, we worked with the local community, as I indicated, and our, worked with our implementing partner, Circadoo, and we, from community meetings and our focus groups, we talked about what are the main compelling reasons for purchasing the stove, and there were 3 main compelling reasons, which were improves health, saves time and money, and aspiration. And we designed marketing messages for all 3, and then we tested the the marketing messages in our feasibility stage, and we found that in subsequent focus groups that the most compelling messages from our consumers were that the health message and the saves time and money. So we absolutely, I agree. Aspirational is very, it's been something that a lot of people have found qualitatively, and I'd love to see some work if anybody's done any hard evidence on aspirational messaging leads to purchase decisions. So there's a lot of discussion around aspirational messages, and we've seen that too, and in other sectors as well, of course. So have shown the role for aspirational messaging. So we did explore that, and we let our participants decide what was most compelling for them. So that's that answer. And then yes, so we agree that I think this is one of our more controversial findings, and I think this is why we do research, that marketing messages have been long touted as the key to purchase decision. Okay. However, there are some significant barriers we found in our community to purchasing a stove that were more, that actually did have effects when we tested scientifically on purchase rates. So unlike marketing messages, which didn't have effect, again, liquidity constraints were very large, and we saw a lot of effect for when we included time payments. So perhaps practitioners need to explore more about what are the the levers for community, for different populations in terms of purchase, and in our more I would say rural poor community that we worked in, the main levers for purchase were liquidity constraints, and the other barriers I described we found also affected adoption, including understanding the product's benefits and belief in durability. So I absolutely am not arguing for no marketing messages, and like Path and Duke, we did live stove demonstrations, and we spent a lot of time marketing our stoves at our sales meetings, and that's important. But when we looked at what drove people's purchase decisions, it did not have a significant effect on willingness to pay for our cook stove. Thanks.
Thanks, Teresa. And just a quick follow-up on that question. Were your marketing messages delivered to rural users, urban, or both?
Right. So the study, the study I described today, we did, this was our rural study that I talked through, and all of our participants were rural households, Kendra. And our marketing messages, as I had mentioned, were designed by, to be very local specific. We spent 6 months designing them with our local team, and included anecdotal stories from women in the communities that had trialed our stove related to the saves time and money, and we actually showed pictures and of women, and then told their story. So we did spend a lot of time trying to design marketing messages which were effective, and so we don't think that that was the that was a factor. Of course, marketing messages, should be, could they be, maybe they could have been improved, but we did spend a lot of time working on them. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We have a question for Nancy. You stated that the PATH study found that cooking demonstrations were the most effective strategy, and the question is, how did you measure this effectiveness? Do we need to unmute?
Thanks. Yeah, it was really, I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I think, it was really, this was a qualitative study primarily, and so it was based on the sale of stoves, and where we found people, most engaged in purchasing them was really through the demonstrations, and people didn't refer to our flyers. And there was success we found when some of the sales agents voluntarily decided to give commissions to the village health team members. So that was interesting to see. We didn't want to structure that in. We left that up to the communities. But when we did see that a few of the sales agents saw the benefit of that, so they gave the village health team members a small commission, and that also seemed to help increase sales. But our numbers were very small. We found quite quickly that the stove was expensive for the local market, and that the fuel challenges of a TLUD, requiring this specially processed fuel and very dry fuel, made it, I think that the word of mouth got around, that this was not the easiest stove to use. So we didn't have a lot of numbers to base this on. It was really more qualitative observation of where the stoves are being sold.
Okay, great. We have another question here on whether any of the project teams explored or actually used carbon credits to help pay for the stoves in their studies.
So this is Teresa, and yes, I've already mentioned in a previous question, and we did. We carbon credited our stove. I'm happy to talk more about that if somebody wants to send me an email about the process, but yes.
So this is Mark. The Duke study, we did not do this, but we did try to experiment with some sensors to measure use in a more sophisticated way as sort of a proof of concept for whether such sensors could be used for carbon crediting. And we think some of our findings are relevant, although we didn't include it in the study itself.
Great. We've also had a couple of questions.
Just from the PATH side, Kendra?
Yeah, sorry about that. Go ahead.
Hey, no problem. This is Greg with Nancy on the PATH side. So we did not access carbon credits for this project, but so that wasn't really a piece there. We tried to price the stove at a level that reflected somewhat its actual cost, and in part because we were interested in potential sustainability and scalability here. Mm-hmm. And that was a big learning to us, was the commercial viability of this stove. Maybe was quite poor, and that partially a factor of the high cost of the TLUD stove, which I think has a relatively high manufacturing cost, so around $12 to $14. And then on top of that, you also need to account for all the costs of the distribution and the sales and the marketing, which I'm not sure, every team doing the research, all these different research projects probably account for that in different ways. But that's something to keep in track. Maybe if there had been a tremendous carbon credit benefit, that would have changed the game. But we did also look at microfinance scenario. We modeled that based on some extensive experience we have with microfinance distribution of water filters, and we found that for this TLUD model of stove, given its kind of manufacturing cost of $10 to $15, even with microfinance and installments, it would you would require a substantial permanent subsidy to sell the stove.
Great, thank you. We've had another couple of questions come in for Teresa on the gender differences comment that you had mentioned, finding that you mentioned. The question is, you suggested that we market features that would encourage men to purchase. So can you expand on what you mean by features that are attractive to men, and also how that might affect the long-term usage of the cook stove, since it's primarily women who will be using it?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I think we're not, this is, many people have been saying that how, durable good purchases are a household level decision. So in terms of cook stoves, one example comes to mind, but there's many examples. I think that I haven't, that we can hope to go, to build towards aspirationally. And one example is the BioLite stove, which is now what they do is they transform the excess energy that's generated from combustion, and they transform that into electricity, and that electricity then has been able to charge mobile phones and power solar lamps. Now there's some, there's controversy around that model too, and I'm not here to pick a winning stove or anything like that, but I do think that in our setting that we find that women have less power over making household decision making just based on their ability to pay. So it's we found like Mark was describing it from Duke about there seems to be a large demand for these types of stoves, but we found that there were liquidity constraints, etc. So for practitioners going forward, I think the comment, the finding is more of, do we push back on producers to say, hey, men are control the purse strings in some of these in our rural communities. So how do we build a product that's attractive to men? And I think that is a good question. And I don't think we've found the perfect answer yet. But is it about? I think more understanding needs to be done about what do men value. I know from the BioLite experience, we trialed their stove in our feasibility stage, and that I described to you in project preparation, and men loved that stove. I mean, we know immediately the opportunity to charge their mobile phone made a lot. We generated a lot of interest in cook stoves from men that previously we hadn't seen. So whether that's just one example, but I think we do need to turn back to producers and say, okay, we're learning more about what's driving demand in our rural communities. So how do we go out and design a stove that's better set? What can we do so to address, to make the product in line with not only, of course, first and foremost, sort of improving health and reducing fuel consumption, making a better product, but can we design a product that will be in line with how households make decisions? So appeal to men as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Teresa. A question for all three of the projects that came in. Were the behavioral change interventions used in the studies based on any models or theories of change? And if so, which ones?
So would you like me to start? This is Mark.
Please.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Okay, so essentially the framework that we were operating from was a logic that these households are making, for the most part, rational decisions in which they weigh costs and benefits. So what our intervention strategies and our pilot approaches were designed to do was to start shifting some of the constraints that may impact them negatively in terms of adoption. So things like changing the price, dropping the price of a stove, is going to relax the budget constraint a little bit. Providing information or social marketing is going to shift demand by increasing demand, by making people aware of the benefits, perhaps. And these are all components that we designed around that framework that these households are making these mostly rational decisions, although we know that households also are affected by other things, and that sometimes choices aren't entirely rational. So that's why this rebate, which is kind of conditional on use, is set up to sort of encourage people to adopt and experiment with the stoves, but also to sort of provide this kind of behavioral incentive that it might have specific impact on change.
Thanks. This is Teresa here. So we too also started with a theory of change model, and for our improved contracts study, as I had outlined earlier, that what we started with was a literature review on what are the obstacles for poor consumers in adopting durable goods, and all consumers. What are the obstacles, and particularly relevant for our setting? And then we identified the obstacles, which I talked about. We hypothesized consumers would be liquidity or credit constrained. They would lack information on the benefits and durability of the product. That they might suffer from self-control problems or bias. And then we tested. We built in these different parts of our contract, like the free trial, to address that obstacle of imperfect information about energy savings, time payments to address liquidity constraints and present bias, and then the right to stop time payments and return the product at any point during the time payments to address imperfect information on product durability. And so we, from our theory of change, we hypothesized these are the barriers. If we address these barriers with methods that have been used in developed markets like the UK and the US, and in other settings that are similar to our context in rural Uganda, and we then designed this contract to see if we could test that theory of change. So yes, we absolutely did, and each of our programs did. And in terms of our message, testing messages, we also were interested. We had a theory of change that marketing messages would increase purchase of the stove, and so we tested that theory. Thanks.
And this is Nancy at Path. We started with the Sanafoam basic framework, which we called Airfoam, to inform our interventions. So we did formative research initially in the communities to help us identify which interventions we would actually introduce. So we had our ideas of what we might do, but we wanted to see what the community, felt were their attitudes and practices about cook stoves, but also what were the opportunities and barriers and motivators in terms of introducing or buying an improved cook stove. So we did these focus groups, and then based on those results, that helped us to understand the behavioral determinants that we then followed up on with our design. So in fact, we had not planned to use, one of our theories of change was to use direct sales agents, which we had found very effective in our water filter work at PATH. But what changed was in our community focus groups, we found people felt very strongly that we should involve the village health teams as sales agents. And we hadn't thought about that, but we in fact changed our model to incorporate them as part of the process.
Great, thank you. And the last question before we're going to run out of time here. For the studies that incorporated financing schemes or trial options into their projects, what was the reason why people either didn't complete the payments or returned the stoves? And is the burden of this put on the manufacturer, or did the project pay for those stoves that weren't paid for or were returned? And then as a follow-up, do you think that manufacturers would be willing to take back stoves that have been returned if people are given that option?
Yeah, great questions, and these are very important in terms of scaling up this model. So why did people return the stove? By and large, we did collect data on that. We're also very interested in that. And by and large, people return the stove because of a catastrophic income event, like they had a health event, they had they moved, or they had some big event. That's what we found evidence-based. So we didn't see a lot of people returning stoves because they didn't like it. That's number one. So it was about financial. It was a financial decision. And in terms of scaling up, and in terms of who paid the cost, so yes, we subsidized. So if somebody returned the stove, we did, that was a cost that we knew we would make for research. Yes, in terms of scaling it up, absolutely. What will manufacturers be willing to take that risk? I think what is convincing for manufacturers is that we did see very high repayment rates. So we saw 90% repayment rates. We gave people 6 weeks in total. We had there was four weekly time payments, but we did it. We built in a 2-week lag just to make sure we could have a little bit of flexibility in our time payments. And again, by involving the local, we had a local focal point person, that was very successful. We paid a very small fee for our to go out and collect these payments, and we also incentivized our local focal point person by, giving her a commission, if you will, a commission structure payment that every stove that she collected, a payment on, that she received the commission. So I think some thoughtful models about incentivizing repayment could help manufacturers to ensure that this contract works. Another option is what we did with our second stoves that were, the less than 10% that were returned, is that we actually had a secondhand stove market. So we had, other people came to us and that were not involved in the study, but that wanted to buy the stove, and we sold them the stove for half price after it had been used. So there are some ways that manufacturers could think creatively about recouping costs. These are very important concerns, but I hope that the 2 scientific studies that we've done and shown very high repayment rates and in a timely manner, that this could be compelling evidence for manufacturers to try, given that if they don't try, the pay within the week offer in our rural communities only saw 5% uptake versus 57% uptake of house, with completed payments. So the difference is so big that the benefits to the manufacturer for offering more flexible contracts, in this case, have far outweighed the losses. Thank you.
Just a couple of comments from the Duke team. So one, we didn't see any households that did not follow up on the payments. So every household that signed up to buy the stove did complete the payments. I think the key element in that was that even though they were able to spread the payments over time, it wasn't too long of a time. So the installments were collected 2 weeks apart, such that this was done within about a little over a month. And the sales teams were also willing to give a household a couple of extra days if they had to find the money quickly. The second piece of this is, the question of whether manufacturers would go along with this, particularly if we found that stoves might start being returned. And the main problem that we had with stoves being returned or not being found at the follow-up survey was that they broke or had some kind of maintenance issue. And so that's why I highlight that as kind of a big question in our study in terms of how well this maintenance could be provided and who would be responsible for doing that. These stoves that we offered technically have a 1-year warranty, so the manufacturers were liable for replacing them. But in reality, that warranty doesn't mean a whole lot because these communities can't access the warranty. They're located so far away from the manufacturers. So what we did in our study with our partner NGO was we bore that cost, and some of the stoves we were able to get them back to the manufacturer and replaced free of charge by the manufacturer who was honoring the warranty. But some of them we just had to get fixed ourselves. So there is some risk there, and I think the answer to that question is more of a long-term question, particularly as these stove start malfunctioning over time.
Great, thank you very much. And Patricia, if you can just go to the last slide on our PowerPoint quickly. I'll just conclude here by saying I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions, but if you have any other questions or if other questions come up, feel free to send us an email. Or you can also visit our website to view recent publications coming out of these studies and to see other information on the studies and other household air pollution efforts that TRAction is engaging in. So thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great day.